Hey guys, and welcome to a new video. My name is Jasper, and on this channel I'll be covering all things related to photo, film and time-lapse, and today I'll be talking about how to capture the night sky. So for some reason the most questions that I get on any of my photos are on the ones that I took during night, and I can understand why, because they are definitely harder to take than the ones you take during the day, but really it's not as hard as you may think. So with this video I want to encourage all of you to go out and try it for yourself, and hopefully I can give some useful tips and tricks along the way. And by the way, if you want to learn how to capture a time-lapse like you've just seen, then make sure to stick around till the end of the video. But firstly, let's talk about the best time to capture the night sky. So if your goal is to capture the Milky Way, which is like the most popular thing to photograph in the night sky, then there are a few things that you will have to consider. One of them being the time of the year, and another one being whether you live in the northern or the southern hemisphere, because then the Milky Way season, as it's called, will actually be slightly different. Now, if you're living in the northern hemisphere like I do, then your Milky Way season will be from February until October, with the best times to capture it being around June and July. And if you're living in the southern hemisphere, then you will be able to capture the Milky Way from January until late November, so you have even more time for that. And also the best time to capture it will be from June and July. And also you want to pick a pretty clear night without a lot of cloud coverage, because that can definitely ruin your chance of seeing the night sky. Another thing that you will have to keep in mind will be the moon, because it will be really hard to capture the Milky Way if there's a full moon in the sky, because it is just way too bright. I like to shoot at around 20 to 30% of moon coverage, because that will give me some light to light the foreground of my scene. But yeah, ideally you want to shoot around new moon, so the skies are dark enough. However, it can also be very nice to specifically go out and shoot during full moon, and I'm not solely talking about those telephoto pictures of the moon, which can definitely look very stunning, but I'm actually talking about using the moonlight to light your photo, because that can have a very surreal feel to it, which I very much enjoy, and I will include some example photos right here. Either way, I recommend doing a lot of planning before you go shoot, and there are some very helpful apps and websites out there, which I will link down in the description, that for example will let you see the location of the moon or the Milky Way during specific times of the night, and that can really help you with finding a location and also planning a composition beforehand. Now let's talk about the best places for capturing the night sky. Ideally you want to have a very dark sky, which also means you want to have low levels of light pollution, which can be a big problem depending on where you live. For example, I live in Germany, and we have a lot of light pollution here, which can make it a bit tricky to capture the night sky. But there are some very helpful light pollution maps online, and I will link one down in the description. Although this may sound a little obvious, also make sure that you pick an interesting location. I feel like many people, when starting out with capturing the night sky, they will only capture the night sky, but it can also be very helpful to include an interesting location as your foreground. Always keep in mind that the same rules apply to astrophotography that apply to all other kinds of photography. So for example, if you're photographing the sunset, Usually you're not just photographing the sunset, but you're also including something else in your frame. Another thing you might want to consider will be the latitude of your location, because for example, if you are very far north, then it might be hard to capture the Milky Way during summer because the sun won't properly set. I've actually had that problem in Norway last summer. But of course, if you get lucky, you'll be able to capture the northern lights during winter. Now that I talked about the best place and time for shooting the night sky, let's move on to gear. So firstly, you'll need a camera that lets you do your settings manually. And generally, full frame cameras are best because they are not cropped like APS-C or MFT. And most of the time, when shooting the night sky, you want to be pretty wide to capture as much of the sky as you can. They also have a lot less noise when you use a high ISO, which can definitely be useful when shooting the night sky. But if you don't have a full frame camera, don't let that stop you. I've taken all of my night sky photos on Fujifilm's APS-C cameras, such as the Fujifilm X-T1, which you can get for a few €100. Even more important than the camera that you'll be using is going to be the lens. I recommend using a wide angle lens because that will let you capture more of the night sky, and also you will be able to use slower shutter speeds, but I'll talk more about that when I talk about camera settings. It's also best to use fast lenses to capture as much light as you can. For example, f2.8 will give you pretty good results. Prime lenses are great because usually they are faster or more affordable than zoom lenses. But of course, if you've got a fast zoom lens like a 16-35 f2.8, then that's a great choice too. For most of my astro photos, I've used Fujifilm's 16mm f1.4, which is definitely very sharp and also fast. Besides your camera and lens, the most important thing that you'll need is a steady tripod, since you will have to do long exposures, and it can also be helpful to bring a remote shutter to set custom exposure times and avoid camera shake. Ideally, it's going to be very dark when you go shoot, so make sure you have some kind of light source like a headlamp or a flashlight, and don't just rely on your phone. It's best to use red light, which will make it a little easier for your eyes to adjust to the darkness, and it is also more considerate towards animals and other photographers. I personally like to turn all the lights off as soon as I arrive on the location, because after a while your eyes will adjust to the darkness. Depending on where you go shoot, it can also get very cold during night, so make sure you're warm enough and bring multiple layers. It can also be quite nice to bring some food and a warm drink. Now let's finally talk about camera settings. Firstly, always shoot in RAW, because that will give you the most flexibility when editing your photos, which you will definitely have to do. You want to use the widest open aperture to capture as much light as you can, which means the smallest number, so for example f1.4 or 2.8. Make sure you don't go too high with your ISO, because that can introduce a lot of noise to your photo, which is definitely something you want to avoid. So find out at which ISO your camera still performs pretty okay, and then use that as your limit. Some cameras perform really well with a high ISO, such as the Sony a7S III, so if you have one of those you can definitely go a bit higher, but I usually stick to around 1600 or maybe 3200 as a maximum. So for your shutter speed, the so-called rule of 500 will be the determining factor. If you expose your photo for too long, the stars will start to trail due to the rotation of the Earth, so always keep that in mind. You can also create star trail images on purpose, which can also look pretty nice, but I will talk more about that later in this video. So if you divide the number 500 by your actual focal length, that'll give you the maximum time you can expose your photo before the stars will start to trail. So for example, with a 16mm lens on an APS-C camera, I can expose for around 20 seconds. And just to be safe, I like to be a bit below that. Furthermore, you'll have to use manual focus, which I always set just a tiny bit before infinity, and to check if your stars are sharp, you can pick the brightest star in your frame and zoom in on that to see if it's the smallest it can be. Another helpful tip that I can give you is to turn down the brightness of your screen, because you might think your photos are exposed correctly when in reality they might be way too dark. I also recommend turning off long exposure noise reduction, because that won't actually affect your RAW files and waste a lot of time on location. If your lens has a built-in stabilization, I would also turn that off, because you won't need that if you're on a tripod and it can lead to blurry shots. Photographing the night sky might be a bit more technical than other forms of photography, but the creative process behind it is equally important, and I can't stress it enough how crucial your composition will be, and also having an interesting foreground. So, for example, if you're shooting at a lake, then try to work with the reflection. If there's an interesting flower, maybe you can use that as your foreground. So definitely try to be creative and don't just focus on the technical part. So when I talked about shutter speeds earlier, I mentioned star trail photography. And if you purposely expose your photo for 30 minutes or 1 hour, you can get some pretty amazing results. I've actually taken single exposures for over an hour, but I wouldn't actually recommend it because it's not the safest method. I would much rather shoot a time-lapse, so set your camera to the interval mode and then take one photo, for example, every 30 seconds, and then later on you will stack those photos together in programs like StarStax or Photoshop, and you can also turn those photos into a time-lapse, which is definitely a bonus. I've also mentioned the northern lights earlier, which for me are the most exciting part about astrophotography, but of course to be able to capture them you have to be quite far north in countries like Iceland or Norway, and there are a few things that you have to consider when you're trying to capture them. So you might have to use faster shutter speeds because they can actually move quite quickly and be pretty bright, and if you're using exposures of 20 to 30 seconds then they might become quite blurry. So play around with different shutter speed and see what works, and if you found a good shutter speed then maybe start a time-lapse, because the northern lights change their shape quite often, and if you're taking a time-lapse then you can afterwards pick a frame that you like and edit that one. Now, if you want to take a time-lapse of the night sky, then all you'll have to do is keep those same settings that you used in your photos and put your camera into the interval mode. Some cameras don't have one built in. In that case, you'll need to get an external intervalometer, but either way, pick an interval which is slightly longer than the shutter speed you're using, and then really you'll just need a lot of patience. So before starting your time-lapse you can also calculate the final length of your time-lapse. If you want a time-lapse which will be 10 seconds long, you will need 250 photos, and if your interval is 25 seconds for example, then you will roughly need 2 hours of shooting that. So it may take a few hours to complete that time-lapse. If you'd like me to make more in-depth videos on star trails, northern lights, time-lapse, or how I edit my astro photos, then please let me know down in the comments, and if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing for more content on photo, film and time-lapse. And if you didn't, feel free to give it a big thumbs down. See you next time.